Welcome to Error 1, the podcast where we explore the small human errors that lead to major disasters. I'm Jan, your host of this show. Today we're talking about the deadliest aviation accident in history, the Tenerife Airport Disaster of 1977. It's a story of miscommunication, assumptions, and a chain of seemingly small errors that led to a catastrophic tragedy and cost so many lives. Imagine this. It's a cloudy afternoon on March 27, 1977. Two Boeing 747s, one operated by KLM and the other by Pan Am. They are sitting on a tarmac on a small airport on the Canary Islands. Hundreds of passengers expecting a routine trip are about to become part of a nightmare. KLM was the first to taxi down the runway. The usual taxiway was blocked by another aircraft. The KLM taxied to the end of the runway and made a 180 turn. At the same time, the Pan Am crew was instructed to taxi down the runway as well. However, they were told to turn left onto the free part of a taxiway. Visibility had become so poor that the crews could not see the other aircraft. They had to rely on instructions from the tower controller, who had also no visual contact with the airplanes. Let's listen in.
Wait a minute, we do not have an ATC clearance.
The KLM is at the end of the runway and the captain wants to take off. The co-pilot quickly points out that they still not have their clearance to do so.
We are waiting for our ATC clearance.
KLM 8705, you are cleared to the Papa Beacon. Climb to and maintain flight level 90. Right turn after takeoff. Proceed with heading 040 until intercepting the 325 radial from Las Palmas BOR.
Roger, sir. We are clear to the Papa Beacon flight level 90.
As soon as they have received clearance from the air traffic control, the captain pushes the throttles forward and accelerates.
We are now a takeoff.
Okay. Stand by for takeoff.
And suddenly there is confusion and hectic activity on all channels.
Report runway clear.
Okay, we'll report when we're clear.
The flight engineer is not sure whether the Pan Am is still on the runway and asks his captain.
Yes.
The KLM aircraft started its takeoff run, although the oncoming Pan Am was still on the runway. Just a few seconds later, the two jumbos collided and exploded. 583 people, including over 60 children, lost their lives. To this day, it is considered the largest single accident in civil aviation. But how did two massive planes end up on the same runway at the same time? And why did no one stop what was coming? Let's look and analyze the error chain together again. The Canary Islands have long been a destination for European tourists. It was increasingly becoming competition for the classic Mediterranean destinations. Since the 1970s, the islands had become a destination for Americans as well. It was particularly popular as a starting point for cruises to the Mediterranean. A flight from New York to Las Palmas took just 6.5 hours. From Central Europe, such as Amsterdam, the Canary Islands could be reached in just 4.5 hours. Not all locals liked the progress of tourism, and certainly not the dependence on Spain that came with it. The local underground organization MPAYAC fought for an independent Canarian state. They chose tourist targets for their bomb attacks, for example South African Airlines office or airports. It all started on the morning of March 27, 1977, when a terrorist bombing at Gran Canaria Airport forced flights to divert to the much smaller Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife. Among those diverted flights were KLM Flight 4805 and Pan Am Flight 1736. The two jumbo jets were among the largest passenger airplanes in existence at the time. The KLM 747 was traveling on behalf of Holland International Travel Group. The captain on this flight was Jacob van Santen. He was KLM's chief training pilot. He was often photographed as an advertising icon for the airline. His picture was also in all KLM in-flight magazines. He had been employed by KLM since 1947 and had trained almost all pilots on the 747. Van Zanten spent more time training in the simulator than actively flying. In this respect, the charter flight was something special for him. Captain Van Zanten took off that morning at 9:31 a.m. from Amsterdam Schiphol with 235 passengers and a crew of 14. The passengers were mainly young families, including 48 children and 3 babies. The second jumbo jet was a Pan Am 747 under the command of Captain Victor Grubbs. It had taken off from Los Angeles the previous night. First stop was New York for a quick refueling. A crew change took place and Grubbs with his crew took off at 2:45 in the morning. It had 380 passengers on board. Most of them were retirees from California. They had booked a 12-day Mediterranean cruise on board the Royal Cruise Line ship Golden Odyssey. The bomb exploded in a flower shop at Las Palmas Airport around the time when the Pan Am 747 approached, almost 13 hours after departing Los Angeles the day before. The Pan Am had plenty of fuel on board for the long-haul flight, so the crew requested to fly holding patterns over Las Palmas until the airport reopened. However, much to their displeasure, air traffic control refused and they were forced to divert to Tenerife like everyone else. The Tenerife Airport wasn't designed for this level of traffic, and as planes piled up on the taxiways, chaos started brewing. Pilots, ground handling, and air traffic controllers were all trying to manage a situation that had never been planned for. The constantly growing number of airplanes had to be parked somewhere. The planes were stuck on the congested taxiways with thick fog rolling in. Visibility was decreasing to only a few hundred meters. Not only passengers, but also the crews became increasingly impatient. The KLM crew had to care about frustrated passengers, but on top of that, Captain Van Zanten was very concerned about the maximum permitted flight duty time. Just a few months earlier, the Dutch government had drastically restricted the regulations. It was no longer allowed to extend the permitted duty times, not even under such special circumstances. Van Zanten was eager to keep his schedule and to take off quickly. To do this, he decided to refuel the plane right there in Tenerife. He intended to keep the ground time on his next stop in Las Palmas to an absolute minimum. However, all of his passengers had to disembark before refueling could take place. Another delay that was to prove disastrous. It took hours before the danger in Las Palmas was averted. The air traffic control announced that no further bombs had been found in Las Palmas. The airport had opened and was allowing flights again. But the KLM was still being refueled. Meanwhile, the Pan Am plane was stuck behind the KLM, waiting for clearance to taxi down the runway. The Pan Am crew received clearance to line up for takeoff. The news was greeted with cheers from relieved passengers. But when they were about to taxi, the crew realized that there didn't seem to be enough room to get around the KLM and the fuel truck. Los Rodeos Tenerife was not designed for large jumbo jets, and there was no way to get past the KLM 747. The Pan Am plane had to wait until the refueling process was completed and all passengers of KLM had reboarded. Meanwhile, the weather began to deteriorate further and fog settled over the airport. The visibility was getting worse, down to just a few hundred feet. The airport is located at an altitude of 2,000 feet, which is around 600 meters, and it's located on the northern mountain range of Tenerife. Due to westerly Atlantic winds, clouds kept forming on the mountains. By the time the KLM crew had finished all the preparations, it was already 4:26 p.m. They were instructed to taxi down the runway and make a 180 turn. In the meantime, the fog had reduced visibility to just 300 meters. Both the KLM crew and the Pan Am crew were unexperienced in regards to Tenerife Airport Los Rodeos. They had landed unexpectedly at an airport that was unfamiliar to them. This made orientation extremely difficult with the dense fog. To make matters worse, extensive work was carried out at the airport. Important parts of the infrastructure, such as the runway lights, were temporarily switched off. There was no ground radar as well. The air traffic controller could not visually see where the airplanes actually were. He had to rely on pilots' transmissions. At 5:06 p.m., the control tower gave the KLM crew permission to taxi into position for takeoff. At the same time, the Pan Am was instructed to follow the taxiway and exit the runway at a specific turnoff. They complied and taxied onto the runway, trying to find their way as best as they could under prevailing poor weather conditions. The thick fog made it almost impossible to see the exit signs. We should also not forget how long the Pan Am crew had been on duty. They'd been awake for over 12 hours flying through the night and were noticeably tired. They were looking forward to get off duty. As the Pan Am crew taxied down the runway, they were confused. Had they already passed the exit? Were they still on the main runway? Unknowingly, they missed the instructed taxiway to exit. Meanwhile, the KLM crew was eager to depart, and that's where the fatal misunderstanding occurred. For a small airport like Los Rodeos, there was only one air traffic controller on the tower. However, he was working at his limits with the number of airplanes. He gave crews taxiing instructions on the ground, as well as clearances for departure routes, and also authorized takeoffs and landings. On the tape recordings, the accident investigators could hear that the television was playing in the background on the tower. A Spanish soccer match was broadcast at the time. We can already observe how the error chain had been set in motion, but it wasn't too late. They could have been able to interrupt the error chain and prevent the accident. We have one partly fully and one fully fueled 747 on the same runway in opposite directions without visual contact. Radio contact with the tower controller was repeatedly interrupted because several radio messages overlapped at the same time. Before each takeoff, the flight crew receives a clearance for the departure route and a separate clearance for takeoff. Same occurred for the KLM crew, but Captain Van Santen was in a hurry. The window of opportunity to take off was getting smaller. He feared that Los Rodeos Airport could close at any time due to the deteriorating weather conditions. Van Santen wanted to leave desperately. The first officer reminded him that they had not yet received clearance for the departure route. The controller gave them the clearance with the words, "Right turn after takeoff," meaning that they would have to fly to the right immediately after departure. The word take off is usually only used if the pilots are actually allowed to take off. Van Santen had confused this clearance and thought they were allowed to take off. This is a classic confirmation error or confirmation bias. We see and hear what we want to see and what we want to hear, and in particular what we expect to see and hear. This is a well-known phenomenon in psychology. Perception is filtered and only lets through what corresponds to our own expectations. But why hadn't the first officer intervened? Van Santen was one of the highest-ranking pilots at KLM and responsible for training. 2 months earlier, he had given this exact first officer his check ride. So there was a big hierarchy gap in the cockpit. The co-pilot had a lot of respect for this captain. The first officer's choice of words was also unfortunate and misleading. He reported to the tower, "We are at takeoff." He meant that they were about to take off, while the air traffic controller understood they were at the takeoff position at this time. It was obvious to the Pan Am crew that Van Santen was in a hurry. In order to prevent a premature takeoff, they again announced that they were still on the runway. However, this radio message was overlaid with the air traffic controller's radio message that the KLM crew should wait. All they heard was, "Okay." Captain Van Santen and his co-pilot were now quite sure that they were permitted for takeoff. The third flight crew member in the KLM cockpit, the flight engineer, inquired whether the Pan American was already off the runway. His question was answered with an irritated, indeterminate yes by both pilots. This came just few seconds before they saw the Pan Am and crashed into each other. Captain Grubbs yelled, "He is coming! He is coming! Get off! Get off!" desperately trying to turn off the runway. But it was too late. At 160 miles per hour, KLM's aircraft slammed into the Pan Am's fuselage. The impact was devastating. The KLM plane lifted off briefly before crashing back down into flames, killing all 248 people on board. Pan Am's fuselage was torn apart. 335 of its 396 passengers didn't survive. With a vast amount of kerosene in both airplanes, the wreckages of the airplanes continued to burn for hours. The Tenerife disaster claimed 583 lives in total, making it the deadliest accident in aviation history. This was the terrible result of a long and disastrous error chain. The airfield was overloaded, the crews were tired, there was poor visibility, and switched off lighting combined with misunderstandings in communication. According to the investigation commission, time pressure on part of the KLM crew, and in particular the captain's expectations, played a decisive role in the disaster. Captain van Santen took off after hearing the word "take off." His colleagues were unable to stop him. So it wasn't mechanical failure. It wasn't sabotage. It was pure and simple human error. Layered mistakes, miscommunication, and assumptions made under pressure. All those people died that day due to a long error chain. Aviation changed after Tenerife. Standardized phraseology was enforced. Cockpit resource management training became mandatory, ensuring that co-pilots could and should challenge a captain if something felt wrong. The way pilots and controllers communicate became clearer and precise, all because of the lessons learned from that foggy afternoon in 1977. Tenerife South Airport, which is mainly used today, was only inaugurated a year and a half later in November 1978. If this airport had existed earlier, the disaster of 1977 would not have gone down in history as the darkest day in civil aviation. And that's it for this episode of Error 1. If you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. And remember, small mistakes can have massive consequences. If you want to learn more about this concept, you can download my award-winning book Error 1 or just visit www.error1.net. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.